The winter of 1733 descended upon London with particular severity, bringing with it not only the customary cold, but a series of events that would forever mark the annals of Temple District history. Within the labyrinthine passages of the Inns of Court, where England's legal minds gather to debate justice and interpret law, an irony of terrible proportions was about to unfold. The very precinct dedicated to upholding order would become the stage for a crime so shocking that it would dominate public discourse for months to come, raising questions about truth, evidence, and the nature of guilt itself. Sarah Malcolm had arrived in the capital some years earlier, her journey taking her from the northern reaches of Durham through a brief sojourn in Dublin, before settling into the demanding rhythm of London life. At 23 years of age, she occupied that uncertain position common to thousands of young women who sustained the city's households through their labor. Her work took her through the chambers of barristers and clerks, where she tended to the endless cycle of washing, mending, and maintaining the garments that marked professional distinction. The Temple knew her as a laundress and cleaning woman, one among many who moved through its courts carrying bundles of linen, ascending and descending worn stone staircases, entering rooms at dawn and departing at dusk. The nature of her employment granted her peculiar access to the private spaces of those she served. Unlike visitors who knocked and waited, unlike even the clerks who maintained strict boundaries, Sarah passed through doorways with keys entrusted to her care, handled personal belongings as part of her duties, and witnessed the daily patterns of those who resided within these chambers. She knew which residents rose early, which kept irregular hours, and which maintained valuables in their quarters. This knowledge came not from deliberate investigation, but from the simple repetition of her tasks, the accumulated observations of someone whose work required her to notice disorder so she might restore order. Economic pressures bore down heavily upon women in her circumstances. The cost of lodging consumed most of what she earned, leaving little margin for uncertainty. A missed day of work meant hunger. An illness meant debt. The competition for positions remained fierce, with newcomers arriving constantly from the countryside, all seeking the same limited opportunities. Sarah moved between multiple employers each week, piecing together enough assignments to survive, never certain that the following week would bring the same arrangements. This precariousness shaped the lives of the serving class, creating a world where today's security offered no guarantee of tomorrow's sustenance. Her associations reflected this marginal existence. Mary Tracy worked similar jobs in nearby establishments, while the Alexander brothers, James and Thomas, performed various tasks that fell beneath the notice of respectable society. They gathered in the taverns along Fleet Street, those establishments where cheap ale and cheaper lodging attracted those who lived by irregular means. Conversations in such places often turned to money, to the frustrations of poverty, to observations about where wealth accumulated and how poorly it was guarded. Whether such talk constituted mere complaint or evolved into something more actionable remained a question that would later assume critical importance. The chambers at Tanfield Court housed 3 women whose circumstances stood in stark contrast to Sarah's own. Mrs. Lydia Dunham maintained the apartment with the assistance of Mrs. Elizabeth Harrison and a young servant named Anne Price. They lived comfortably by the standards of the Temple, with furnishings that spoke of moderate prosperity and the security that came from established positions. Mrs. Dunham kept her money in a locked box, a fact known to Sarah through her regular visits to collect and return linen. During these routine calls, Sarah necessarily observed the layout of the rooms, noted where items of value rested, and became familiar with the household's daily rhythms. Nothing in this observation departed from what any servant would notice in the course of proper duties, yet such knowledge would later be interpreted through a darker lens. The first days of February brought no indication that the routine patterns of Temple life would soon shatter. Sarah continued her rounds, appearing at appointed times with her bundles, exchanging brief words with those who employed her, and moving through the familiar geography of courtyards and passages. Yet something had shifted in her circumstances or her thinking, though precisely when this change occurred remains impossible to establish with certainty. What can be documented is that during the final week before the 4th of February, her behavior began to register in the memories of those who encountered her, creating a record that would later be assembled into a pattern. On the afternoon of the 3rd, she completed her usual circuit of chambers, collecting soiled linen and delivering cleaned garments to various residents. Multiple witnesses placed her within the temple precinct throughout that day, her presence unremarkable except in retrospect. She carried the tools of her trade, possessed keys to several chambers as part of her legitimate duties, and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone long accustomed to navigating these spaces. The question of whether she also carried some darker purpose remained invisible to those who saw her pass. That evening brought the typical quieting of the district, as legal work concluded and residents withdrew to their private quarters. The occupants of the Dunham apartment retired at their customary hour, securing their door and settling into the routines of rest. The surrounding chambers likewise fell silent, as candles were extinguished, and the temple assumed its nighttime character. Nothing in the external appearance of Tanfield Court suggested that within hours, its peace would be irrevocably destroyed. The darkness of early morning, that period between midnight and dawn when the city lay suspended between days, would prove crucial to subsequent events. During these hours, when few legitimate reasons existed for movement through the temple courts, someone entered the Dunham apartment. The method of entry suggested possession of a key rather than forced intrusion, as the lock showed no signs of violent manipulation. Whether Sarah Malcolm herself turned that key, whether she accompanied others who did so, or whether her account of Tracy and the Alexander brothers contained some element of truth, became the central question around which everything else would revolve. What occurred inside those chambers during the dark hours can only be reconstructed from the physical evidence discovered later. The 3 women who had retired peacefully did not wake to greet the morning. Violence had visited them in their sleep, swift and terrible, leaving them beyond help before consciousness could even register danger. Mrs. Dunham lay in her bed in the main chamber, her position suggesting she had died without struggle. Mrs. Harrison occupied the second sleeping space, similarly motionless, her fate sealed with equal finality. Young Anne Price had been discovered in a narrow space beside her bed, her body concealed in a manner suggesting someone had attempted to hide the terrible work from immediate view. The apartment bore unmistakable signs of search and theft. Drawers stood open, their contents disturbed. The locked box in which Mrs. Dunham secured her guineas had been forced and emptied, its contents vanished. Items of silver plate that normally graced the side table were missing. Clothing lay scattered, suggesting rapid examination of possible hiding places. Whoever had committed these acts had done so with sufficient time to conduct a thorough search, implying either that the household had been incapacitated early in the intrusion, or that the perpetrator possessed confidence, born of familiarity with the premises, and certainty of remaining undiscovered during the nighttime hours. As dawn approached on the 4th of February, Sarah Malcolm appeared in the chambers of Mr. John Carroll, at an hour well before her services were expected or required. She began tending to his fire, though no arrangement existed for her to do so at such an early time. Her movements struck Carroll as peculiar, particularly her handling of a bundle she kept close to her person, repositioning it multiple times as though uncertain where it might rest without drawing attention. When he questioned her presence, her explanations remained vague, her manner distracted. She adjusted items that required no adjustment, moved objects without purpose, and displayed an agitation wholly inconsistent with the calm efficiency that normally characterized her work. Carol's attention fixed upon a discoloration visible on the fabric of her bundle, a stain whose character he could not immediately identify, but which seemed inconsistent with ordinary laundry work. When he directed her to explain the mark, Sarah offered no response, instead gathering her belongings with sudden haste and departing his chambers without completing any task that might justify her early arrival. The encounter left Carol with a sense of unease he could not precisely articulate, though later he would recognize it as the instinctive recognition that something fundamental had gone wrong. Shortly thereafter, Sarah encountered William Johnson while collecting garments in the passage near Fleet Street. As she bundled the shirts, she made a remark that Johnson would later recall with crystalline clarity. She informed him that her days of carrying laundry for others were approaching their conclusion, that circumstances were about to improve substantially. Johnson, occupied with his own labor and accustomed to the idle boasts of those who dreamed of escaping their stations, dismissed her comment with a practical observation that aspirations would not complete the work still before her. Sarah did not argue the point, merely continued with her task, but the confidence in her voice carried a quality that transcended mere wishful thinking. Witnesses subsequently placed her near the entrance to Tanfield Court multiple times that morning, lingering without apparent purpose, observing the staircase that led to the Dunham apartment. Her presence there might have been explained by legitimate business, except for its frequency and duration, creating a pattern of surveillance rather than routine passage. When other servants approached, she would move away, only to return once they had passed, maintaining a vigil whose purpose remained opaque to those who noticed it. At approximately 9 o'clock, Mrs. Mary Love arrived at Tanfield Court to call upon Mrs. Dunham as previously arranged. She climbed the staircase and knocked upon the apartment door, expecting the prompt response that had always greeted her visits. Silence answered her knock. She tried again, applying greater force, and waited. Still no sound emerged from within. The absolute quiet that met her efforts struck her as wrong, a deviation from pattern that triggered immediate concern. Mrs. Dunham maintained regular habits, and unexpected absence from home would have been communicated in advance. The continued silence suggested something beyond a simple failure to hear the knock. After several attempts produced no result, Mrs. Love sought assistance from a locksmith, explaining that she feared something amiss within the apartment. The locksmith accompanied her to the landing and began examining the lock mechanism, preparing to gain entry through professional means. During this preparation, Sarah Malcolm materialized in the courtyard below, positioning herself where she could observe the proceedings at the apartment door. She did not approach or offer assistance, nor did she inquire about the nature of the emergency. Instead, she watched with an intensity that several witnesses later characterized as inappropriate given the circumstances, neither surprised nor curious, but rather expectant, as though waiting for confirmation of something she already knew. When the lock finally yielded and the door swung open, Mrs. Love stepped across the threshold and called out to Mrs. Dunham. The greeting died in her throat. She advanced several paces into the front chamber before stopping abruptly, one hand rising to cover her mouth as the full horror of the scene registered upon her senses. She gestured urgently for the locksmith to bring his lamp closer, her voice failing as she tried to articulate what lay before her. Mrs. Dunham remained in her bed, but the stillness of her form carried the unmistakable quality of death. The locksmith, following Mrs. Love's shaking finger toward the second chamber, discovered Mrs. Harrison in similar condition, her life extinguished with the same terrible finality. Before either could fully process what they had found, Sarah Malcolm appeared in the doorway behind them, having ascended the stairs without summons or invitation. She entered the apartment and stood motionless, her gaze moving methodically from one chamber to the next, taking in the scene with an expression that struck Mrs. Love as disturbingly composed. Mrs. Love commanded Sarah to remain where she stood, but the instruction seemed almost unnecessary, as Sarah showed no inclination to flee or assist, merely continuing her systematic observation of the death that surrounded them. The calmness of her demeanor in the face of such carnage would later be cited as evidence of prior knowledge, the composure of someone witnessing expected results, rather than experiencing genuine shock. The locksmith, gathering his courage, proceeded to search for Anne Price, who should have been present in the apartment. The small side chamber appeared empty at first glance, the bed unoccupied, and its covering disturbed. He moved cautiously into the room, his lamp casting shadows that danced across the walls. When he looked behind the screen and beneath the bed frame, he discovered the young servant's body, concealed in the narrow space between furniture and wall, positioned in a manner suggesting deliberate attempt at hiding. The sight caused him to recoil, his professional composure momentarily shattered by the realization that all three occupants had met the same fate. By this time, the commotion had drawn servants from neighboring chambers, their voices creating a rising din of alarm and speculation. Mrs. Love, struggling to maintain her own equilibrium, informed them in clipped tones that all three women were beyond help, and that the authorities must be summoned immediately. The word spread through Tanfield Court with the speed that tragedy always commands, transforming the quiet morning into chaos as residents emerged to learn what catastrophe had befallen their precinct. As additional light illuminated the apartment's interior, the extent of the violation became apparent. The disorder spoke of methodical search rather than panicked grabbing. Drawers had been opened and their contents examined, clothing pulled from storage and left where it fell, the locked money box forced open and thoroughly emptied. The missing guineas represented a substantial sum, enough to transform the circumstances of someone living on the margins of subsistence. The absent silver plate added to the inventory of theft, creating a picture of robbery executed with sufficient time and confidence to be thorough. The arrival of the authorities brought formal structure to the investigation. Officers examined each chamber, documenting the position of bodies and the nature of disturbance, establishing the facts that would later be presented at trial. Their questions immediately turned to access and opportunity. Who possessed keys to the apartment? Who had been present in the temple during the crucial hours? Which servants had moved through the courts that morning before the discovery? The answers repeatedly circled back to Sarah Malcolm, whose movements placed her within the precinct throughout the relevant period, and whose work granted her familiarity with both the premises and the routines of its occupants. When an officer summoned her for questioning on the landing, Sarah's responses carried an undertone of preparation, as though she had anticipated interrogation and rehearsed her account. She claimed to have entered the apartment only after hearing voices, drawn by curiosity about the disturbance. As she spoke, her hands repeatedly moved to her hair, adjusting the cap that covered it with a nervous persistence that drew the officer's attention. He instructed her to remove the cap, and when she complied with obvious reluctance, several gold guineas tumbled from the folds where they had been concealed. The coins struck the floor with sharp metallic sounds that seemed to echo through the sudden silence, each clink a small verdict announcing guilt. Sarah insisted the money belonged to her, earned through honest labor and saved over time. Yet when pressed to explain how a laundress, whose wages barely covered subsistence, had accumulated such a sum, her explanation collapsed into incoherence. The amount corresponded too precisely with Mrs. Dunham's missing guineas to be dismissed as coincidence. The officers placed her under immediate restraint and escorted her to her lodgings for comprehensive search. What they discovered there demolished any remaining possibility of innocent explanation. Hidden beneath her bed, wrapped in rags and pushed into the darkest corner, lay a silver tankard bearing Mrs. Dunham's identifying mark, its presence in Sarah's possession impossible to reconcile with any legitimate transaction. The concealment itself spoke volumes, for if the item had been acquired honestly, no reason existed to hide it in such a manner. Alongside the tankard, investigators found additional items of linen that matched descriptions of materials taken from the Dunham apartment, each piece adding another link to the chain of evidence forming around the accused woman. Most damning of all were the garments Sarah herself had worn, which upon close examination revealed stains that appeared disturbingly similar to blood. The fabric showed evidence of hasty washing, incomplete attempts to remove discoloration that had set too deeply into the weave to be fully erased. Experts who later examined these items would testify that the stains displayed characteristics consistent with human blood, rather than the animal blood that might appear on a servant's clothing through kitchen work. The location of the stains, their pattern and distribution, suggested contact with a bleeding source, rather than mere spillage from food preparation. The accumulation of physical evidence created a narrative that required no elaborate theory to connect. Sarah had possessed access through her work, opportunity through her presence during the crucial hours, and motive through her desperate economic circumstances. The stolen property had been found either on her person or concealed in her lodging. Her behavior on the morning of discovery had been inconsistent with innocence, marked by evasion rather than shock, by watching rather than helping. Each element, examined individually, might permit alternative explanation, but assembled together, they formed a structure of guilt that seemed architecturally sound. Yet Sarah maintained an alternative account, one she would elaborate as her trial approached. She insisted that Mary Tracy and the Alexander brothers had committed the actual violence, that she had merely facilitated their entry and shared in the proceeds, that her hands had not struck the fatal blows that ended 3 lives. This version of events positioned her as an accomplice rather than principal actor, a critical legal distinction that might influence both verdict and sentence. However, proving the involvement of these others required producing evidence of their presence, their participation, their existence beyond Sarah's claims. Authorities initiated inquiries to locate Tracy and the Alexander brothers, seeking witnesses who might place them near Tanfield Court during the relevant hours. Despite the crowded nature of the temple and the many eyes that observed its comings and goings, no one could recall seeing any individuals matching their descriptions in the vicinity that night. The tavern keepers who knew them reported nothing unusual about their movements in the days surrounding the 4th of February. No evidence emerged to corroborate Sarah's story that they had entered the apartment, committed murder, and departed with stolen goods. Their absence from the record became as notable as Sarah's documented presence. The trial commenced at the Old Bailey, with all the formality that serious criminal proceedings demanded. The courtroom filled with spectators, drawn by the sensational nature of the case, the combination of multiple deaths and domestic betrayal, creating precisely the sort of narrative that captured public fascination. Sarah stood in the dock, her appearance neat despite her incarceration, maintaining an air of composure that some interpreted as dignity under pressure, and others read as the coldness of someone capable of terrible acts. The prosecution constructed its case through careful presentation of the documented facts. Witnesses testified to Sarah's presence in Mr. Carroll's chambers at an inappropriate hour, to her strange behavior with the blood-stained bundle, to her boast about improving circumstances made hours after the murders. The discovery of guineas in her hair, the finding of Mrs. Dunham's tankard in her lodging, the blood-marked clothing, all entered the record as exhibits whose significance seemed self-evident. Each piece of evidence was introduced methodically, building toward a conclusion that appeared inevitable. Mrs. Mary Love recounted the discovery of the bodies, her voice wavering as she described the moment when comprehension dawned that all 3 women had been killed. She testified to Sarah's unexplained presence in the apartment doorway, to the peculiar absence of distress on the accused woman's face when confronted with scenes that had left others traumatized. The locksmith corroborated her account, adding details about Sarah's behavior in the courtyard below while he worked to open the door, her focused watching that suggested anticipation rather than innocent curiosity. Mr. Carroll described the early morning encounter in his chambers, emphasizing Sarah's agitation and her defensive handling of the bundle she carried. He spoke of the stain he had observed, the evasive responses when questioned, and the abrupt departure that left assigned tasks incomplete. William Johnson testified about her confident prediction that her days of menial labor were ending, words spoken mere hours after wealth had been violently extracted from the Dunham household. The cumulative weight of these testimonies created a temporal map of suspicious behavior surrounding the murders, like accusatory markers. The defense faced the formidable challenge of explaining away evidence that seemed to point in only one direction. Sarah's advocate attempted to introduce reasonable doubt by emphasizing the absence of direct witnesses to the actual killings, arguing that presence before and after a crime did not constitute proof of commission during the crime itself. He pressed Sarah's account of Tracy and the Alexander brothers, suggesting that the failure to locate them reflected inadequate investigation rather than their non-existence. Perhaps they had fled London immediately after the murders, taking most of the stolen property with them, while leaving Sarah to face consequences alone. This theory required the jury to believe that Sarah had been exploited by more cunning criminals, who had arranged matters so that all physical evidence pointed toward her, while they escaped undetected. It demanded acceptance of the premise that she possessed enough knowledge to assist in planning the robbery, but insufficient intelligence to avoid obvious incrimination. The argument faced the inherent difficulty of asking 12 men to embrace complexity when simplicity lay readily available. Why construct an elaborate scenario involving phantom accomplices when the woman before them could be connected to the crime through documented facts? Sarah herself took the stand, a decision fraught with risk, but necessary given the prosecution's case. She spoke clearly, maintaining that her role had been limited to providing information about the household and its valuables, that Tracy and the brothers had done the actual breaking in and killing. She claimed they had given her a portion of the guineas as payment for her assistance, which explained why she possessed them. The tankard had been forced upon her, she insisted, left in her lodging without her consent as part of their scheme to ensure her silence through implication. The bloodstains on her clothing came from handling items they had given her, not from direct participation in violence. Her testimony contained elements that might have resonated with a different jury under different circumstances. The exploitation of vulnerable women by criminal men was not unknown in London's underworld. Servants desperate for money might indeed be drawn into schemes whose full horror they failed to comprehend until too late. Yet her account suffered from internal inconsistencies and convenient gaps in memory regarding crucial details. She could not explain why, if she had merely been a passive recipient of stolen goods, she had concealed them so carefully. She could not account for her presence in Carroll's chambers with blood-stained items, if her contact with the crime scene had been so minimal. She could not justify her composed observation of the discovered bodies, if she had truly been shocked by the murders Tracy had allegedly committed. The prosecutor's closing argument methodically dismantled the defense narrative. He pointed out that no evidence whatsoever supported the existence of these alleged accomplices beyond Sarah's self-serving claims. He noted that her story evolved in its telling, details shifting to accommodate uncomfortable facts as they emerged. He emphasized that the stolen property had been found in her exclusive possession, that her movements throughout the relevant period placed her precisely where the crime occurred, and that her behavior before and after discovery displayed consciousness of guilt rather than the outrage of wrongful accusation. He addressed the physical evidence in sequence, demonstrating how each element connected to form an unbroken chain. The guineas concealed in her hair matched exactly the sum missing from Mrs. Dunham's strong-box, a precision that defied coincidental explanation. The tankard bearing ownership marks had been hidden beneath her bed, rather than displayed or sold, behavior consistent with someone knowing the item to be stolen, rather than legitimately acquired. The blood-stained clothing, found among her personal belongings and showing signs of inadequate cleaning attempts, suggested direct contact with violence, rather than mere proximity to its aftermath. He further examined her conduct throughout the critical period, noting that every action she took aligned with guilty knowledge. Her unexplained presence in Carol's chambers at dawn, attempting to manage incriminating materials while inventing reasons for being there, demonstrated awareness that evidence required concealment. Her boast to Johnson about imminent improvement in circumstances, made hours after acquiring sudden wealth through murder, revealed confidence born of believing she had succeeded in her crime. Her composed observation of the death scene, standing in the doorway while others reeled from shock, reflected the calm of someone witnessing an expected outcome, rather than discovering an unexpected tragedy. The prosecution concluded by addressing the fundamental implausibility of the defense narrative. If Tracy and the Alexander brothers existed and had committed these murders, why had they left all incriminating evidence with Sarah? Why would experienced criminals allow a witness to their acts to retain stolen property that could connect them to the crime? Why had no one in the densely populated temple seen these supposed accomplices entering or departing the Dunham apartment during the night? The absence of any corroborating evidence for their involvement, combined with the overwhelming presence of evidence connecting Sarah to every aspect of the crime, rendered her story not merely questionable, but logically untenable. The jury received instructions regarding the standards of proof and the weight to be accorded different types of evidence. They were reminded that conviction required certainty beyond reasonable doubt, but that such certainty could be established through circumstantial evidence, when the circumstances permitted no other rational conclusion. They retired to deliberate, carrying with them the burden of determining whether a young woman would live or die, based on their assessment of the facts presented. Their absence proved remarkably brief, within a short period that suggested swift consensus, rather than prolonged debate. They returned to the courtroom. The foreman rose and delivered the verdict that had been reached without significant dissent. Guilty. The single word fell upon the assembled crowd with the finality of a hammer blow, transforming Sarah Malcolm from accused to convicted, from defendant to condemned. No recommendation for mercy accompanied the verdict, no suggestion that mitigating circumstances warranted consideration. The jury had concluded that the evidence permitted only one interpretation, and they had rendered judgment accordingly. The presiding judge, having received the verdict, assumed the grave responsibility of pronouncing sentence: death by hanging, to be carried out in accordance with established practice and schedule. Furthermore, in keeping with the Murder Act that permitted anatomical study of executed criminals, her body would be delivered to surgeons for dissection following the execution. This additional provision served dual purposes. It advanced medical knowledge while simultaneously ensuring that the condemned would not receive proper burial, a final indignity meant to underscore the severity of the offense and provide additional deterrent to potential criminals. Sarah received the sentence without visible reaction, maintaining the composure that had characterized her demeanor throughout the trial. Whether this reflected genuine emotional control, shock that prevented full comprehension, or the resignation of someone who had anticipated this outcome, remained impossible to determine. She was removed from the courtroom under guard and conveyed to Newgate Prison, where she would await execution in the company of others who had likewise received capital sentences. The weeks between conviction and execution created an unusual interlude, a period during which Sarah occupied a liminal space between life and death, present in the world, but no longer truly part of it. During her confinement at Newgate, Sarah became the subject of intense interest from various quarters. Prison chaplains visited regularly, their duty being to prepare condemned prisoners spiritually for the transition from earthly existence to divine judgment. Ministers from outside the prison also sought access, motivated by a combination of religious obligation and curiosity about the inner workings of a mind capable of such acts. Among these was Mr. Guthrie, a clergyman who engaged Sarah in extended conversations, aimed at extracting a full confession that might provide clarity regarding the events of the 4th of February. These pastoral visits produced a series of statements that would complicate, rather than clarify, the public understanding of the case. Sarah spoke at length about the crime, but her accounts varied in crucial details, depending upon her audience and the timing of the conversation. In some versions, she maintained her trial testimony that Tracy and the Alexander brothers had wielded the violence, while she merely facilitated their access. In others, she admitted to greater involvement, acknowledging that she had entered the apartment and participated more directly in the robbery, though still insisting others had committed the actual murders. The inconsistency of these narratives raised questions about which, if any, represented genuine truth. She elaborated on her claimed relationship with Mary Tracy, describing meetings in taverns along Fleet Street where plans had allegedly been formulated. According to this version, Tracy had learned about Mrs. Dunham's money through Sarah's casual mentions of the household's relative prosperity. The Alexander brothers had been brought into the scheme to provide physical force if resistance was encountered. Sarah claimed she had believed they would wait until the occupants left the apartment, that the violence had not been part of the original plan, that she had been horrified when she learned all 3 women had been killed. Yet this protestation of unwilling involvement sat uneasily alongside her possession of the stolen property and her demonstrated efforts to conceal it. The chaplains who heard these varying accounts found themselves uncertain which elements to credit. Some portions of her statements contained specific details that suggested genuine recollection, while other sections seemed carefully constructed to minimize her culpability. The emotional tenor of her confessions likewise fluctuated, ranging from apparent remorse to defensive justification to matter-of-fact recitation of events as though discussing someone else's actions entirely. This variability made it difficult to assess her true mental state or the authenticity of her professed repentance. Meanwhile, authorities continued investigating the alleged accomplices, driven partly by thoroughness and partly by the public controversy that had begun to emerge around the case. Despite expanded efforts, no trace of Tracy or the Alexander brothers could be found in the locations Sarah identified as their usual haunts. Tavern keepers who knew the criminal element of Fleet Street could not identify individuals matching the descriptions provided. No witnesses came forward to report seeing such persons in the Temple district during the relevant period. The absence grew more conspicuous with each failed attempt to locate them, suggesting either that Sarah had fabricated their involvement entirely or that they possessed remarkable skill in vanishing without trace. This evidentiary vacuum created space for public debate about the justice of the verdict. Pamphlets began circulating that questioned whether the investigation had been sufficiently thorough, whether the speed of the trial had permitted adequate examination of all possibilities, whether a young woman was being executed, partly because her poverty made her vulnerable, while wealthier or more connected criminals might have escaped scrutiny. These publications did not dispute the horror of the crime or the need for punishment, but they raised uncomfortable questions about the certainty with which guilt had been assigned. Defenders of the verdict responded with their own printed arguments, emphasizing the strength of the circumstantial evidence and the weakness of the alternative theory. They noted that Sarah herself had never provided verifiable details about her supposed accomplices, that her story had evolved conveniently to explain away each damning fact, and that the physical evidence pointed unambiguously toward her guilt. The debate played out in coffee houses and ale houses across London, reflecting broader anxieties about crime, punishment, and the reliability of justice in cases where direct eyewitness testimony was absent. The contradictions in Sarah's prison statements became particularly significant when compared to testimony given at trial. During court proceedings, she had been relatively consistent in portraying herself as a minor participant, exploited by more dangerous criminals. In Newgate, speaking to religious visitors, her accounts shifted toward acknowledgement of greater involvement, while still deflecting ultimate responsibility. Some observers interpreted these variations as the gradual erosion of defensive lies, the slow emergence of truth as death approached and earthly concerns diminished. Others saw calculated manipulation, attempts to generate sympathy or confusion that might somehow delay or prevent the inevitable. One particularly detailed confession emerged through Mr. Guthrie's efforts, in which Sarah described entering the apartment during the early morning hours while the occupants slept. She claimed to have unlocked the door using a key she had duplicated during her legitimate work, admitting this premeditated preparation while still maintaining that others had accompanied her inside. According to this version, she had guided them through the chambers, indicating where valuables were kept, but had remained in the front room while they proceeded to the bedchambers. She insisted she had heard sounds suggesting violence, but had not witnessed the actual killings, a distinction she appeared to believe held moral significance. This account, when examined critically, raised as many questions as it answered. If she had truly remained separate from the murders themselves, why had her clothing borne bloodstains requiring concealment? If accomplices had carried out the violence, why had they left her with incriminating evidence while presumably escaping with the majority of the stolen goods? Her explanation that they had forced items upon her to ensure her complicity seemed insufficient, given the careful hiding of the tankard beneath her bed, an action suggesting voluntary concealment rather than coerced possession. The publication of these competing narratives created a peculiar situation where Sarah's guilt regarding the robbery seemed indisputable, while uncertainty lingered about the extent of her involvement in the murders themselves. For legal purposes, the distinction mattered little, as participation in a felony that resulted in death carried capital punishment, regardless of who struck the fatal blows. For public understanding and historical record, however, the question of whether she had been primary actor or auxiliary participant remained significant. As the execution date approached, interest in the case intensified rather than diminished. Artists sought permission to sketch Sarah in her cell, creating images that would be sold to a public fascinated by the intersection of youth, crime, and approaching death. The most notable of these artistic endeavors came from William Hogarth, whose portrait of Sarah Malcolm captured her in prison dress, her expression enigmatic, neither defiant nor broken. The painting would outlive all participants in the drama, becoming a permanent record of a woman in the final days before state-sanctioned death. Sarah's demeanor during this period struck visitors as remarkably controlled. She did not rage against her fate, nor did she dissolve into the hysterical despair that characterized some condemned prisoners. Instead, she maintained a kind of detached cooperation with the processes surrounding her, speaking when addressed, accepting the ministrations of chaplains without resistance, but displaying little emotion that might reveal her inner state. This composure continued to generate conflicting interpretations, seen by some as evidence of remorselessness, and by others as the dignity of someone facing unjust punishment with courage. The question of truth became increasingly academic as the 7th of March arrived, bringing with it the finality that no amount of debate or investigation could forestall. The machinery of execution operated according to established schedule, indifferent to uncertainty or controversy. Sarah's guilt had been determined by the only authority empowered to make such determinations, and the sentence would be carried out, regardless of lingering questions about accomplices or the precise degree of her participation in violence versus theft. The morning of execution began with the rituals that had become standardized through repetition. Prison officials entered Sarah's cell at the appointed hour, finding her awake and dressed in the simple garments provided for condemned prisoners. The preparation involved no elaborate ceremony, merely the practical steps necessary to transfer her from confinement to the execution site. She was placed in the cart that would carry her through London streets, a journey designed not merely for transportation, but as public spectacle, a demonstration of justice enacted, and a warning to those who might contemplate similar offenses. The route from Newgate to the execution ground near Fleet Street wound through districts where crime and poverty intersected, where the crowd that gathered to witness hangings drew from all social strata. Executions attracted enormous audiences, transforming the occasion into a strange carnival where moral instruction, entertainment, and communal participation in justice merged into a single event. Vendors sold food and drink, pickpockets worked the dense crowds with practiced efficiency, and spectators jostled for advantageous viewing positions from which to observe the condemned prisoner's final moments. Sarah's procession moved slowly through streets lined with onlookers, whose reactions ranged from jeering condemnation to sympathetic silence. Some in the crowd shouted insults, calling her murderess, and worse, their voices laden with righteous fury against someone who had violated both law and the basic trust that should exist between servants and employers. Others watched quietly, perhaps recognizing in her youth and circumstances the fragility that separated survival from catastrophe for thousands of London's working poor. A few women wept, though whether for Sarah specifically or for the terrible spectacle of state killing remained unclear. The condemned woman maintained her characteristic composure throughout the journey, neither weeping nor protesting, her gaze directed forward rather than engaging with the crowd surrounding the cart. Observers later disagreed about the significance of this demeanor. Some interpreted it as callous indifference, the absence of appropriate fear or remorse. Others saw it as remarkable courage, the ability to face death with dignity, despite its public and humiliating nature. Still others suggested shock had numbed her to the reality of what was approaching, that her apparent calm masked internal terror too overwhelming to express. Upon reaching the execution site, the procedures moved forward with practiced efficiency. The hangman, a professional whose expertise lay in efficiently ending life, made the necessary preparations. Sarah was positioned appropriately, the rope adjusted to specifications that experience had shown would produce the desired result. No last-minute intervention arrived, no messenger bearing reprieve or commutation of sentence. The moment that had been ordained by the court's judgment arrived without ceremony or delay. The execution itself proceeded without notable incident or complication. The drop occurred, the rope performed its function, and Sarah Malcolm's life ended in the manner prescribed by law for those convicted of murder. The crowd reacted with the mixture of satisfaction, horror, and relief that typically accompanied such events. Some turned away before the final moment, unable to witness the actual death, despite their willingness to attend the spectacle. Others watched intently, perhaps seeking some revelation in the final instant, some sign that might confirm guilt or innocence beyond the verdict already rendered. Following the required interval to ensure death had occurred, officials removed the body from the gallows and prepared it for the next stage mandated by the court. The Murder Act's provision for anatomical dissection reflected contemporary beliefs about punishment, extending beyond mere death, ensuring that criminals would not receive the Christian burial that might provide spiritual comfort. The body would instead serve utilitarian purpose, advancing medical knowledge through examination of its internal structures. This additional indignity was meant to amplify deterrence, while benefiting society through scientific progress. Sarah Malcolm's physical remains were conveyed to the appointed surgeons, who would conduct their examinations according to the developing practices of anatomical study. The dissection would be thorough and methodical, treating the body as educational material, rather than as the mortal remains of a specific individual. The surgical examination that followed provided anatomical data, but offered no insights into the questions that truly mattered. The physicians who conducted the dissection documented their findings with clinical precision, noting structures and anomalies that contributed to medical understanding, but the dead flesh before them could not speak to innocence or guilt, could not confirm or refute the existence of Mary Tracy and the Alexander brothers, could not resolve whether Sarah had wielded violence herself or merely facilitated others who had. The body yielded its physical secrets while retaining all mysteries of intention and truth. In the weeks and months following the execution, the case refused to fade quietly into the archives of completed criminal matters. The conflicting statements Sarah had made during her imprisonment continued to circulate in printed form, each version finding advocates who insisted it represented the authentic account, while dismissing alternatives as fabrication or coercion. Readers who had never attended the trial nor spoken with Sarah themselves nonetheless developed firm convictions about what had truly occurred in the Dunham apartment during those dark hours of the 4th of February. The complete absence of evidence regarding the alleged accomplices gradually shifted from being a troubling gap in the investigation to becoming the central controversy of the entire case. If Tracy and the Alexander brothers had never existed, then Sarah's elaborate narratives about their involvement constituted remarkable fiction, sustained even as death approached. If they had existed and participated as she claimed, then their successful disappearance represented either extraordinary luck or remarkable skill, and the execution of Sarah alone meant justice had been only partially served. Neither possibility provided satisfactory closure. Some commentators argued that the weight of physical evidence had been overwhelming, regardless of accomplice questions. Sarah had possessed the stolen property, worn blood-stained clothing, demonstrated guilty knowledge through her behavior, and occupied the precise intersection of opportunity and access required to commit the crime. Whether she had acted alone or with others seemed almost irrelevant, given the certainty of her substantial participation. The jury had correctly assessed the evidence before them and reached the only reasonable verdict available. Others countered that the investigation's failure to pursue the accomplice theory with sufficient vigor reflected assumptions about class and credibility. Sarah's poverty made her vulnerable to suspicion, while also rendering her claims less worthy of serious investigation. Had a person of higher social standing accused specific individuals of participating in murder, authorities might have expended greater effort to locate them. The speed with which the case moved from crime to conviction to execution suggested eagerness for resolution rather than commitment to comprehensive truth. The debate extended beyond Sarah's specific case to broader questions about criminal justice and evidentiary standards. How much certainty did circumstantial evidence provide? When did the absence of alternative explanations constitute proof, rather than merely the failure of imagination or investigation? What obligations did authorities have to pursue exculpatory possibilities, even when the accused appeared obviously guilty? These questions had no simple answers, and the Malcolm case became a reference point for arguments that would continue across subsequent decades. The three women whose deaths had initiated this entire chain of events gradually receded from public consciousness as attention focused increasingly on their accused killer. Mrs. Lydia Dunham, Mrs. Elizabeth Harrison, and Anne Price became supporting characters in a drama centered on Sarah Malcolm, their own lives and circumstances reduced to context for someone else's story. This shift reflected a tendency to find criminals more fascinating than victims, to seek understanding of transgression rather than commemoration of loss. Yet their deaths remained the irreducible fact at the center of everything else. 3 lives had ended with terrible violence in the supposed safety of their own chambers. Whether ended by Sarah's hand alone or in combination with others, whether motivated purely by greed or by some more complex mixture of desperation and opportunity, the result was the same. They had been alive on the evening of the 3rd of February, and dead by morning, their transition from existence to absence accomplished through deliberate human action, rather than natural cause or accident. The physical spaces where these events occurred continued their mundane existence long after their brief moment of terrible significance. Tanfield Court resumed its quiet rhythms, new occupants moved into the Dunham apartment, and the Temple District carried on with its legal business as though nothing extraordinary had transpired within its precincts. The stones and passages that had witnessed crime and its discovery retained no memory of what they had seen, offering no testimony that might resolve lingering uncertainties.